Rain, thick, unrelenting, a black curtain of water swallowing the gaslight glow of Lexington's streets. Hooves strike the cobblestones with the sound of distant war drums. A carriage door creaks open, spilling a woman's silhouette into the storm. Velvet skirts cling to her legs, a parasol useless against the torrent. She walks with the calm of someone accustomed to being watched, even when the shadows leer. Her name is whispered, not spoken. Belle Brezing. She is the last Madame of the South, and this night, Lexington knows it. The camera lingers on the dripping awnings of shop fronts, the boarded windows of saloons, and the gaunt faces of children pressed against the rain-streaked glass of the city's tenements. Then, like a sudden wound torn open, the scene shifts to a mansion glowing defiantly against the gloom. Velvet curtains frame tall windows, shadows ripple like ghosts across the glass, and music, ragtime piano, playful, illicit, spills into the storm. Inside, the air is heavy with the scent of perfume, tobacco, and the faint sweetness of bourbon. Men laugh too loudly. Their voices rise with bravado, as if to drown out the knowledge of where they are. Cigar smoke curls upward, twisting in the lamplight, a fog as thick as the storm outside. And at the centre of this theatre of desire, draped in jewels and satin, sits the woman they have come to see, Belle Brezing. Her eyes are sharp, unyielding, lined with kohl, like a queen presiding over court. She lifts a glass of whiskey to her lips, her hand steady despite the years that have etched themselves into her face. Around her, the women she commands move like actresses in a play, laughter rehearsed, flirtation calculated, touches timed to perfection. They are daughters of the city's shadows, but in this house, her house, they glitter. The narrator's voice cuts through the haze. Belle Brezing was not born into luxury. She clawed her way to it. One velvet curtain, one jewelled hairpin, one stolen night at a time. To some she was a demon in lace, corrupting the very soul of Lexington. To others she was the only honest broker in a city that thrived on secrets. But whether whispered in shame or admiration, her name carried weight. She was the South's last great madam, a queen of vice in a land that demanded purity by day, indulgence by night. The camera pans across the parlour. A senator leans too close to a courtesan, his lips shining with liquor. A horse breeder throws dice against a polished table, his laughter loud enough to rattle the glasses. In one corner, a young lawyer stares into his drink, guilt painted across his face, though his hand trembles toward the thigh of the girl beside him. This is Lexington at its most honest, not in the daylight where churches toll bells against sin, but here, under Belle's velvet roof, where masks are dropped and appetites revealed. But the glamour is fragile. The thunder outside cracks like a warning. A newspaper, damp from the storm, lies discarded on the floor near the door. Its headline, smeared in ink, reads, "Vice District must be cleansed. Demand reformers." The words lie beneath muddy footprints, trampled by men who will vote for the very crusaders calling for Belle's ruin. This tension, this hypocrisy, is the marrow of her story. Belle notices the paper. Her lips curl into the faintest smile, a flicker of defiance. She has seen headlines come and go, crusades rise and fall, reformers howl, policemen raid, rivals whisper, and still her house stands, for now. She rises, silencing the room with nothing more than the rustle of her gown. "Gentlemen," she says, her voice honey over steel, "enjoy yourselves." The night is long, and tomorrow can wait. Laughter erupts again, glasses clink, and the piano resumes its reckless tune. But the camera lingers on Belle's face. Her smile fades when no one is watching. In her eyes is something deeper than power, the weight of memory, the cost of survival. The narrator lowers his tone, almost a confession. She was both adored and reviled, sheltered and hunted, a sinner and a saint depending on who told the tale. But to understand Belle Brezing, to understand how a woman could rise from ruin to rule Lexington's most notorious house, one must first understand the city itself. Lexington was a place of horses and bourbon, of sermons and scandals, of wealth parading in daylight and sin hiding by lamplight. A city that demanded purity on paper and paid for pleasure in secret. The rain continues to hammer against the windows. A bolt of lightning floods the room in a white flash, revealing for a split second the fragile illusions of grandeur. Tired faces beneath powdered makeup, desperate smiles behind polished teeth, hunger that no wealth can fill. Then the room returns to its golden glow, as if the truth never showed its face at all. Belle turns toward the window, her silhouette framed against the storm. She whispers to herself, or perhaps to no one at all, "Let them come." Fade to black. The curtain falls on Belle's opening scene, not as a caricature, not as a villain, but as the embodiment of Lexington's contradiction, the velvet queen of shadows standing defiant while the city outside sharpens its knives. The narrator's final words in this chapter drift like smoke. Before there was Belle, there was Lexington, a city ripe for sin, a city that fed her rise. To know her, we must walk its streets before she ever laid her claim. To know her, we must return to the beginning. The storm quiets. The gas lamps flicker. The sound of horses' hooves echo again, not in 1900, but decades earlier, Lexington, when Lexington was young and booming, when its future queen of shadows had not yet been born. The camera begins to pull us back in time, toward the Lexington that made Belle possible. The camera lingers on the dripping awnings of shop fronts, the boarded windows of saloons, and the gaunt faces of children pressed against the rain-streaked glass of the city's tenements. Then, like a sudden wound torn open, the scene shifts to a mansion, glowing defiantly against the gloom. Velvet curtains frame tall windows, shadows ripple like ghosts across the glass, and music, ragtime piano, playful, illicit, spills into the storm. Inside, the air is heavy with the scent of perfume, tobacco, and the faint sweetness of bourbon. Men laugh too loudly. Their voices rise with bravado, as if to drown out the knowledge of where they are. Cigar smoke curls upward, twisting in the lamplight, a fog as thick as the storm outside. And at the centre of this theatre of desire, draped in jewels and satin, sits the woman they have come to see, Belle Brezing. Her eyes are sharp, unyielding, lined with kohl like a queen presiding over court. She lifts a glass of whiskey to her lips, her hand steady despite the years that have etched themselves into her face. Around her, the women she commands move like actresses in a play, laughter rehearsed, flirtation calculated, touches timed to perfection. They are daughters of the city's shadows, but in this house, her house, they glitter. The narrator's voice cuts through the haze. Belle Brezing was not born into luxury. She clawed her way to it, one velvet curtain, one jewelled hairpin, one stolen night at a time. To some she was a demon in lace, corrupting the very soul of Lexington. To others she was the only honest broker in a city that thrived on secrets, but whether whispered in shame or admiration, her name carried weight. She was the South's last great madam, a queen of vice in a land that demanded purity by day, indulgence by night. The camera pans across the parlour. A senator leans too close to a courtesan, his lips shining with liquor. A horse breeder throws dice against a polished table, his laughter loud enough to rattle the glasses. In one corner, a young lawyer stares into his drink, guilt painted across his face, though his hand trembles toward the thigh of the girl beside him. This is Lexington at its most honest. Not in the daylight where churches toll bells against sin, but here, under Belle's velvet roof, where masks are dropped and appetites revealed. But the glamour is fragile. The thunder outside cracks like a warning. A newspaper damp from the storm lies discarded on the floor near the door. Its headline, smeared in ink, reads, "Vice District must be cleansed. Demand reformers." The words lie beneath muddy footprints, trampled by men who will vote for the very crusaders calling for Belle's ruin. This tension, this hypocrisy, is the marrow of her story. Belle notices the beard. Her lips curl into the faintest smile, a flicker of defiance. She has seen headlines come and go, crusades rise and fall, reformers howl, policemen raid, rivals whisper, and still her house stands, for now. She rises, silencing the room with nothing more than the rustle of her gown. "Gentlemen," she says, her voice honey over steel, "enjoy yourselves. The night is long and tomorrow can wait." Laughter erupts again, glasses clink, and the piano resumes its reckless tune. But the camera lingers on Belle's face. Her smile fades when no one is watching. In her eyes is something deeper than power, the weight of memory, the cost of survival. The narrator lowers his tone, almost a confession. She was both adored and reviled, sheltered and hunted, a sinner and a saint depending on who told the tale. But to understand Belle Brezing, to understand how a woman could rise from ruin to rule Lexington's most notorious house, one must first understand the city itself. Lexington was a place of horses and bourbon, of sermons and scandals, of wealth parading in daylight and sin hiding by lamplight. A city that demanded purity on paper and paid for pleasure in secret. The rain continues to hammer against the windows. A bolt of lightning floods the room in a white flash, revealing for a split second the fragile illusions of grandeur. Tired faces beneath powdered makeup, desperate smiles behind polished teeth, hunger that no wealth can fill. Then the room returns to its golden glow, as if the truth never showed its face at all. Belle turns toward the window, her silhouette framed against the storm. She whispers to herself, or perhaps to no one at all, "Let them come." Fade to black. The curtain falls on Belle's opening scene, not as a caricature, not as a villain, but as the embodiment of Lexington's contradiction. The velvet queen of shadows, standing defiant while the city outside sharpens its knives. The narrator's final words in this chapter drift like smoke. Before there was Belle, there was Lexington, a city ripe for sin, a city that fed her rise. To know her, we must walk its streets before she ever laid her claim. To know her, we must return to the beginning. The storm quiets. The gas lamps flicker. The sound of horses' hooves echo again, and not in 1900, but decades earlier, when Lexington was young and booming, when its future queen of shadows had not yet been born. The camera begins to pull us back in time toward the Lexington that made Belle possible. The city does not sleep. Even after the church bells have long since silenced and the university lamps flicker out, Lexington hums in the dark like a restless heart. The sound is not one thing but many. The click of dice rolling in a back room, the clatter of boots in an alley, the faint moan of a fiddle behind shuttered doors. The respectable homes on Gratz Park lie in neat rows, their parlours silent, curtains tightly drawn, yet only a few streets away, another world thrives. It is a world of contradiction, the very marrow of Lexington's identity. Imagine the evening carriages. On one side of Main Street, the elite roll by in glossy black vehicles, their horses well groomed, their harnesses gleaming. Inside sit men, with starched collars and women in gowns, their eyes trained forward, never to the side. But if the camera pans only a few feet from their route, the same city reveals a different face. Dim-lit doorways where women lean with painted lips, alleys where drunken laughter stumbles and collapses, the shadows of bare feet disappearing into the dark. The contradiction is deliberate. Lexington, like its gentlemen, knows how to keep its sins at arm's length while never straying far. By the 1870s, Lexington was booming. The Civil War had scarred the South, but Kentucky's peculiar position, neither fully Union nor Confederate, neither wholly conquered nor wholly free, allowed it to rebuild in ways other states could not. Tobacco exports fattened wallets. Bourbon distilleries thrived. Their barrels rolled down to the railways that connected Lexington to Cincinnati, Louisville, and beyond. Horse farms swelled with new investment, and the Kentucky Derby was beginning its march toward immortality. Money poured in, and with money came indulgence. Lexington was not New Orleans, with its flamboyant parades and carnivals of sin, nor was it Chicago with its sprawling industrial vice. Lexington's vice was quieter, more intimate, more hidden, but no less real. Its men travelled, and they brought back appetites. The gamblers who came for horse races brought dice and cards. The whiskey men brought thirst, and the young men of the university brought reckless hunger that demanded satisfaction. Thus bloomed Lexington's underworld. The narrator's voice cuts through like smoke in the lamplight. Every city breeds its shadows. But Lexington's were unique. They were not sprawled in the open like New Orleans, nor roaring in chaos like Chicago. They were polite shadows, genteel shadows. They dressed in waistcoats and bowed at church doors, and yet by night they slipped into rooms perfumed with lavender and sin. Hypocrisy was not merely tolerated, it was expected. In such soil, corruption did not wither. It flourished. The camera moves through 3 layers of Lexington in a single night. First, the polished halls of a social ball, chandeliers drip with crystal, violins sweep through waltzes, gowns sweep the floor like tides of silk. The mayor shakes hands with horse breeders. Wives smile, cheeks powdered, eyes darting. The dance floor glimmers like a painting. Second, only blocks away, the roar of a saloon. The air is sticky with spilled whiskey, the tables scarred with knives. Men argue over cards, fists slam the wood, a pistol clinks onto the table as warning. A woman with a tired smile pours drinks she has watered down, her apron stained. Third, deeper still, in a brothel disguised as a boarding house. Curtains flutter as laughter and moans weave together. A judge, recognisable from the polished halls only hours earlier, sits now with his tie undone, his words slurred, his hand wandering over a courtesan's shoulder. He whispers, promises he will never keep. She smiles, because she knows. Lexington's citizens lived with this split as if it were natural. Children were taught that vice was the curse of the weak, even as they watched their fathers disappear into the night. Sermons thundered against lust and greed, yet the collection plates filled with the same coins earned in gambling halls. Women were trained to maintain purity, but when purity became too confining, men knew exactly where to go. The hypocrisy was not hidden. It was the city's unspoken contract. But shadows never exist without hunters. By the late 19th century, Lexington's churches and women's groups began to stir. Moral reformers gathered in parlours, reading aloud lurid reports of fallen women. They spoke of disease, of ruined marriages, of souls led astray. Pamphlets circulated, declaring that vice would choke the very soul of Kentucky. Some believed them, others laughed behind closed doors, but all felt the tension mounting. It is in this climate that a woman like Belle Brezing would rise. For every sermon that condemned women of the night, there were 10 men who kept them alive with coin. For every reformer's pamphlet, there was a whispered address passed from one gentleman to another. The very forces that condemned Belle's kind ensured she would never lack for business. The camera pulls back to show Lexington from above. Its churches, its racetracks, its factories, its red light district burning faintly like embers. The voice of the narrator descends to a whisper, almost conspiratorial. Lexington was a city that demanded saints by day and sinners by night. It built its wealth on bourbon and horses, and it spent that wealth in silence behind velvet curtains. It was a city waiting for its queen. And in 1860, when a child was born into poverty, unwanted and whispered about, Lexington's hypocrisy had already prepared her throne. The screen flickers into shadow. We hear a baby's cry again, weak, desperate, echoing against thin walls. A mother stumbles across the room, bottle clinking as it falls from her hand. Outside, the city continues its masquerade. Inside, a child enters the world without legitimacy, without wealth, without safety. Her name will be Belle, and Lexington, this city of masks, will one day wear her mark forever, fade to black. The baby's cry lingers into silence. Then in the darkness, the faint rattle of an empty whiskey bottle rolling across the floor. A woman's sob. A door slams. The narrator breathes the final line like a curse. Belle Brezing's childhood would be forged not in velvet, but in shadows. The year was 1860, and Lexington was already old in its sins. The cobblestones on Main Street had carried gamblers and preachers alike, and its alleyways whispered of both fortunes and failures. Into this city, poised on the edge of war and hypocrisy, came a child who would bear the weight of shame before she ever spoke her first word. She was born not into velvet, but into shadows, the illegitimate daughter of a mother already known more for her vices than her virtues. The house in which Belle first opened her eyes was no mansion. Its walls sagged with damp, its roof leaked with each storm. Cracks in the wood let the winter wind slide through, and the summer heat lingered inside like a suffocating hand. Her mother, Annie, was not a woman the city pitied. She drank too much, spoke too loudly, and bore a child with no husband to give the child legitimacy. In Lexington, such things were never forgotten. The city might tolerate hypocrisy in its powerful men, but women were not granted such luxuries. A woman without a husband was a woman already condemned, and her child condemned with her. From the beginning, Belle's life was marked by whispers. Neighbours muttered about her mother's sins, about the shame stamped upon the infant like a birthmark. Children on the street learned their cruelty from their parents' murmurs, and by the time Belle was old enough to understand words, she already knew what it meant to be outcast. She did not belong to the church circles that braided ribbons and sang hymns. She did not belong to the parlour floors where daughters of better families learned the piano. She belonged to the shadows her mother inhabited, the alleys and side streets where laughter turned bitter after dark. Her mother's drinking worsened. The bottle was both her solace and her chain, pulling her deeper into despair while numbing the shame she carried. Sometimes Annie was affectionate, cradling Belle against her breast, singing half-forgotten lullabies through slurred lips. At other times, she was cruel, lashing out with words sharp as broken glass. The girl never knew which mother she would face when she returned home. She learned to walk softly, to listen for the tone of footsteps, to sense the tremor in her voice before it turned into rage. There was no father to protect her, no grandfather to offer guidance, no respectable family name to shield her from the world. There was only Annie, and Annie was too often lost in the haze of drink to remember the needs of her child. Poverty pressed hard upon them. Belle's shoes wore thin, her dresses patched until they were more patch than cloth. Hunger gnawed at her, and she learned early how to find scraps, how to charm neighbours into slipping her bread, how to survive on what others left behind. Children in such conditions are either broken or sharpened. Belle was sharpened. She watched everything, listened closely, remembered details others ignored. The habits of survival became the tools she would later wield as weapons, but at the time it was only endurance. Lexington in those years was not kind to the poor. The Civil War tore the country apart, but Kentucky, though not seceded, bled all the same. Soldiers passed through, farms were ravaged, and prices climbed. The rich, insulated by wealth and land, endured. The poor, already clinging to the margins, suffered worst. For a child like Belle, illegitimate and female, survival was not granted. It had to be stolen. By the time she was 10, she had already seen things most children never should. She saw her mother collapse on the floor, breath sour with whiskey, her face streaked with tears and vomit. She saw men come and go, some kind, some cruel, none permanent. She saw fights erupt in alleys, blood staining the mud, and no one lifting a hand to help. She learned quickly that the world was not safe, and no one was coming to rescue her. If she were to live, she would have to find her own way. Work was the only path open to her, and even that path was narrow. She scrubbed floors, fetched water, carried loads heavier than her small frame could bear. For pennies she bent her back until it ached, her hands raw from labour. The women she worked for sometimes pitied her, but more often they scorned her, seeing in her only her mother's disgrace. Like mother, like daughter, they whispered, and Belle heard every word. It etched itself into her memory, not as surrender, but as fuel. There were darker lessons too. As a girl barely into her teens, she discovered the dangers that lurked in every shadow. Men who lingered too long, hands that brushed against her too deliberately, promises of candy or coin that were nothing more than traps. She was still a child, but the world saw her differently, as prey. And when at last her defences failed and the inevitable happened, she learned the most brutal lesson of all. Innocence was not something the world protected. It was something it devoured. The shame of abuse in those years was not carried by the abuser, but by the victim. Belle carried it alone, whispered about, judged, pitied only in ways that cut deeper than cruelty. She did not choose the life of a fallen woman, but it was thrust upon her long before she had words to name it. The city that forgave its men refused to forgive her. It was during this period of despair that she bore her first child. She was scarcely more than a girl herself, unwed, poor, and already marked by the sins of her mother. The whispers grew louder. Neighbours shook their heads, clucking tongues as though her downfall were inevitable. For many women in her position it was. Some vanished into illness, into poverty too deep to climb from. Others ended in the cemetery before their 20s. The world had little mercy for women who bore children without names to give them. Belle's child was frail, the product of hunger and sorrow, yet Belle loved her fiercely. She cradled the infant with a tenderness she had rarely received herself. For a moment, perhaps, she believed love might save them both. But the city's scorn was relentless. Mothers pulled their daughters away from her, as if shame itself were contagious. Doors closed to her when she sought work. Every step forward was met with reminders of what she was, or what they believed she was, destined to become. The infant did not live long. Whether by sickness, malnutrition, or the sheer cruelty of chance, death came swiftly. The loss hollowed Belle. and yet it also hardened her. Where another girl might have broken, she refused to shatter. Instead, she learnt the cruelest truths of all. Nothing in this world would be given freely, not even love. If she were to survive, she would need more than hope. She would need power. The child was gone, but the whispers remained. They would never leave her panda. In Lexington, memory was long, and reputations, once tainted, were never cleansed. She could not undo the shame of her birth, nor the stain of her mother's drinking, nor the cruelty of her first abuse. She could not silence the tongues that spoke her downfall as a prophecy. But she could transform those very shadows into weapons. She could bend the city's hypocrisy to her advantage. Even as a teenager, she began to observe with clarity what others overlooked. She noticed how men who condemned women like her in public sought them out in private. She noticed how wealth excused the sins of some but not others. She noticed how desire made fools of men, and how a clever woman could turn that foolishness into survival. The seeds of her future were planted in those years of suffering, watered by grief and fertilized by shame. Belle's early life was a crucible, and each flame stripped away another illusion. She learned that love could vanish, that mothers could fail, that neighbours could condemn, and that innocence could be stolen. What remained was not fragility but resilience, hard, sharp and unyielding. The narrator's voice returns soft and heavy, as though carrying a secret. She was born in shadows, raised in whispers, and marked by shame. But in those shadows she found her armour. In those whispers she found her resolve. And in that shame she found her hunger. Many girls would have been destroyed. Belle was forged. The screen fades to black, but the echo of a child's cry lingers, mingling with the sound of a bottle rolling across the floor, glass clinking like chains. Then silence. The silence breaks with the low hum of music, not yet the polished piano of her mansion years, but the crude fiddle of a brothel parlour. The camera rises toward the flickering gaslight of Lexington's red light district. Belle is older now, walking into the world that had always been waiting for her. The narrator delivers the final line of the chapter like a tolling bell. Her baptism into vice was not a choice. It was an inheritance fade out. The years blurred together in a haze of hunger, whispers and survival. For Belle, childhood was not a season of innocence, but a season of endurance. She grew up on the margins of Lexington, in neighbourhoods the wealthy would never visit, except perhaps in the safety of daylight. The streets were narrow and muddy, the houses leaning as if tired of holding themselves upright, their windows broken or shuttered with boards. Rats scurried through alleys, children darted barefoot between wagons, and the smell of whiskey, sweat and sickness lingered in the air. It was here that Belle's world unfolded. The mornings were harshest. She would wake to the sound of her mother's coughing, the rasp of lungs weakened by drink and despair. The fire was often cold, the cupboard bare. If there was bread, it was stale. If there was milk, it was sour. Belle learned to eat quickly, silently, grateful for whatever scraps remained. Then she would slip into the streets, where the city itself became both her classroom and her tormentor. She watched the other girls, those with ribbons in their hair and shoes polished to a gleam, walk to school with their mother's hands guiding them. Belle envied them, but also studied them. Their voices were higher, their words softer, their eyes untroubled. They lived in a world that pretended not to see girls like her. If they spoke to her at all, it was in cruel little jabs, rehearsed from what they had overheard at home. Bastard child. Whiskey's daughter. No better than her mother. The words struck her like stones, but she did not cry where they could see. She learned to swallow her tears, to keep her face still, to let her silence speak its own defiance. Her mother, Annie, was both comfort and curse. On her rare good days, she sang to Belle, her voice cracked but still carrying fragments of a younger, happier woman. She would stroke her daughter's hair, promise her that life could change, that they might yet find a place in the world. But the bottle always won. More often Annie raged, bitter at the world, at men who had used her, at neighbours who despised her, at a daughter who reminded her of all she had lost. Her hand could be tender one moment, striking the next. Belle never hated her mother, but she learned early never to trust her moods. The men were worse. Annie's drinking drew them in. Men who offered coin for her company, men who stayed too long, their laughter sour and their tempers quick. Belle would hide when she could, pressing herself against the thin boards of her room, listening to the sounds of her mother's degradation. Sometimes she caught their eyes when she emerged. eyes that lingered too long, eyes that measured her as though she were already marked for the same path. The danger was constant, a shadow that thickened with every year she grew older. It was in these years that Belle first brushed against the world of vice that would later define her. Running errands for neighbours, she sometimes found herself near the district where brothels stood. She would pause at the edges, watching as men slipped inside, hats low, collars high. The women who leaned from the windows seemed like queens compared to her mother, painted, perfumed, draped in gowns of bright colours. They laughed loudly, shamelessly, their voices carrying into the street. To the young girl they seemed powerful, untouchable, though she could not yet understand the cost of that power. She envied them, feared them, and recognised, with some instinct deeper than words, that she belonged more to their world than to the world of the ribboned girls on Main Street. The whispers about her grew. Children repeated what they heard from their parents, that she was doomed, that no daughter of Annie Brezing would ever rise above disgrace. Teachers looked at her with pity or suspicion. Shopkeepers hesitated before handing her goods, as though dishonour itself might stain their wares. Belle grew accustomed to the way eyes lingered on her, not with affection, but with judgment. The city had already written her future, long before she had the chance to write it herself. When her first child came, the result of coercion more than choice, she was scarcely more than a child herself. The shame was unbearable. She hid when she could, wrapped the infant in rags, and tried to shield it from the scorn of neighbours, but she could not shield it from sickness, from hunger, from the merciless hand of fate. The baby died within a year, leaving Belle hollowed with grief and fury. The loss broke something in her, but it also awakened something else. She had lived through cruelty, hunger, abuse, and now death. There was nothing left the world could take from her that she had not already tasted. The girl who might have remained meek was gone. What remained was a survivor, wounded, scarred, but determined never to be powerless again. Lexington whispered more loudly than ever now. She'll end up just like her mother. That girl's no better than the women in the red light district. Belle heard it all, and though each word cut, they also steeled her. If she was already condemned, why not make condemnation into a crown? If the city would never forgive her, why not learn to master its unforgiving ways? The nights after her child's death were the darkest. She would sit by the window, staring into the lamplit streets, watching the silhouettes of men and women move through the fog. The sound of laughter would drift toward her, brittle and hollow. Sometimes she thought of slipping into the night and never returning, disappearing into some other town, some other life. But poverty is a chain stronger than steel. She had no means to leave, no allies to help her. Lexington was her prison, and if she could not escape it, she would have to rule it. Her mother's decline grew worse. The bottle consumed Annie's last traces of beauty, her last fragments of hope. Belle watched her mother with both pity and resolve. Annie had been broken by the city, by its judgment, by its hypocrisy. Belle swore she would not be. She would not end in a gutter, nameless and forgotten. She would take what scraps of power she could find and wield them without apology. The narrator's voice returned, solemn and heavy. She was a child of shadows, marked by illegitimacy, by hunger, by abuse, by loss. Every step of her childhood was a wound, and every wound became armour. Lexington had already cast her as its outcast, its fallen, its future sinner, but Belle Brezing would not simply play the role written for her. She would rewrite the play itself. The screen fades into blackness. Out of the silence, the sound of footsteps emerges. Belle's, older now, moving down a gaslit street. She passes a saloon, a gambling hall, a brothel. The doors are open, the music spills out, the voices beckon. She does not yet belong inside, but the shadows are pulling her closer. The final image lingers. A teenage Belle, her eyes sharp, her face pale in the lamplight, staring at the world that will soon consume her. She is no longer the child who wept in hunger. She is something harder now, something dangerous. The narrator's last words of the chapter are a whisper, half prophecy, half curse. Her baptism into vice was not a choice. It was her inheritance fade to black. The year was 1879, and Lexington's streets seemed darker than ever. The war was long past, yet its shadow lingered in the faces of men who had lost too much and found solace in bourbon, cards, and women. The city wore its hypocrisy more brazenly now. Sermons in the morning, whiskey by noon, sin by dusk, and into this world of contradiction, Belle Brezing, not yet 20, walked with a face too old for her years, her eyes already carrying the weight of shadows. Her mother was gone by then. Annie's decline had been slow, pitiful, inevitable. Years of whiskey had hollowed her body and her mind until nothing remained but a husk. Belle watched her fade, helpless but also hardened, and when at last Annie's body was carried from the house, there were no crowds, no mourners, just Belle, alone, standing on a doorstep that suddenly felt like a tomb. For the first time in her life, she was utterly unmoored. She had no family, no protector, no guide. Only the city itself remained, a predator draped in respectability. Lexington wasted no time in reminding her of her place. Doors that might have opened for other girls slammed in her face. Families with work to offer shook their heads, muttering about her mother's sins. Men eyed her not as a worker but as something else, an object of use. It was then that Belle began to understand the truth she had always suspected. Respectability was a currency she would never possess, and if she could not buy her survival with purity, she would buy it with the only thing the city had already marked as hers. The first step into vice was not dramatic. It was quiet, desperate, almost ordinary. An older man, wealthy, married, with polished boots and a soft voice, offered her money she could not refuse. She hated him, hated his smell, his weight, his whispers of affection he did not mean. But when it was over, there were coins in her hand, food on her table, a roof above her head for one more week. Disgust warred with relief, but survival triumphed. She had crossed a threshold, and there was no crossing back. The city whispered, of course it always whispered. Some shook their heads in pity, others in scorn. But whispers did not feed a hungry stomach. Belle began to see herself less as a victim, and more as a player in a cruel game. If the world would use her, she would learn how to use it in return. She entered her first brothel not long after. The house was dim, the wallpaper peeling, the perfume cloying to disguise the smell of sweat and smoke. Women lounged in faded gowns, their laughter brittle, their smiles painted on like masks. Some were kind to her, offering advice in low voices. Others saw her as competition and treated her with cold disdain. Belle watched them all, not just their faces, but their movements, the way they leaned into men, the timing of their laughter, the way they feigned affection. It was theatre, every bit of it. And Belle, who had learned to survive by observing, studied as though her life depended on it, because it did. The men who came were powerful in daylight, horse breeders, businessmen, politicians. At night they surrendered their masks, seeking comfort, indulgence, or domination. Belle saw quickly that their needs were not simple, and their weaknesses were many. She learned to flatter one man's ego, to mirror another's grief, to silence a third with a touch. Each encounter was a lesson, each coin payment an education. She was not yet a madam, not yet even experienced, but she understood something most of the other girls did not. This was not just vice, it was strategy. The narrator's voice cuts in, solemn and sharp. Where others were broken, she became watchful. Where others surrendered, she sharpened. Every cruelty she had suffered, every whisper of shame, every loss of innocence, all became tools. Belle Brezing was not merely entering vice, she was baptizing herself in its fire, yet the dangers were as real as the coins. Belle saw girls dragged into alleys by drunken clients, returning with bruises and eyes that no longer wept. She saw disease spread like wildfire, cutting down women in their 20s with fevers and lesions. She saw men who promised protection abandon the girls to ruin. The brothel world was a graveyard as much as a theatre, and Belle knew she could not survive by charm alone. She would need rules, discipline, and above all, cunning. One night, as rain hammered the brothel windows, Belle sat at a vanity, staring into the cracked mirror. The reflection was harsh, her painted lips, powdered cheeks, eyes lined with kohl. She hardly recognized the girl who once wept at a child's grave. But behind the paint was something harder. She whispered to herself, as if vowing to the glass, never again powerless. Never again prey. That vow became her compass. She chose her clients more carefully, fusing those who seemed violent, cultivating those who carried influence. She learned which policemen could be bribed, which preachers, secretly visited, which rivals could be undermined. Slowly, even as a young woman among veterans of the trade, she carved out a place for herself. The house itself became her school. She studied the madam who ran it, her rules, her punishments, her dealings with clients. She saw how the madam kept order, how she extracted profit, how she balanced fear with favour. Belle absorbed it all, knowing one day she would no longer be a student but a queen. The city outside continued its dance of hypocrisy. On Sundays, the same men who visited her house sat in pews with their wives, eyes lowered in false devotion. Reformers shouted about cleansing Lexington of sin, yet the houses thrived. Belle realised the contradiction was her greatest protection. So long as the powerful required her services, she could never be erased, no matter how loudly the reformers screamed. But survival was not yet security. Rivals lurked, jealousies festered, and violence was never far away. More than once, Belle awoke to the sound of screams in the night. A girl beaten, a man stabbed in an alley, a body carried out under a sheet. Each incident was a reminder. She was walking a knife's edge. To live, she could not simply serve the system. She would have to master it. The narrator lowers his voice, almost conspiratorial. In baptism, one is cleansed. But in Belle's baptism, there was no cleansing, only fire, smoke and shadow, and she did not wash away her mires, she learned to make sin her power. The final image of the chapter lingers on Belle standing at the threshold of the brothel, the gaslight casting her face half in shadow, half in glow. Behind her, the laughter and music of vice. Ahead of her, the streets of Lexington, glistening with rain, dangerous, beckoning. She does not look back. The narrator delivers the last words like a verdict. She had crossed the threshold. She would never return. The girl of shadows was gone. In her place, the strategist was born. Fade to black. The first months in the brothel were like drowning and breathing at once. Each night Belle painted her face, powdered her skin, and fastened dresses that belonged more to theatre than to life. The gowns were gaudy, cut low to draw the eye, stitched in silks too bright for daylight. When she caught herself in the mirror, she saw not a young woman but a mask, a doll created for the appetite of others. And yet, behind the mask, her eyes sharpened. She was not the most beautiful girl in the house, not the most practised, not even the most sought after. But Belle had something rarer. She noticed things. She noticed which men tipped generously and which only pretended wealth. She noticed which girls drank too much and let their guard down, which whispered secrets they should have kept. She noticed when the madame slipped coins into her pocket from the night's earnings, and when she quietly passed a folded note to the policeman who arrived each Friday, his pocket suddenly heavier after leaving. Knowledge became Belle's currency. She spoke little at first, her laughter quieter than the others, her movements more deliberate. Men who sought loud, boisterous women sometimes overlooked her, but those who wanted something deeper, something clever, gravitated toward her. Belle let them talk, and they did, about their businesses, their enemies, their secrets. She became a confessor draped in velvet. And unlike a priest, she charged dearly for her silence. Danger hovered constantly. Fights broke out downstairs when gambling debts went unpaid. Girls fell ill, their coughs worsening, until one morning their beds were empty and their names erased from memory. Once, a man struck a girl so hard her blood stained the wallpaper. The madam had him thrown out, but the girl never recovered. Belle learned then the importance of choosing clients carefully, of recognizing a flash of violence before it erupted. Her survival depended not only on charm, but on caution. There were rivals too. One girl, older and bitter, sneered at Belle's quiet ways, calling her a fraud, accusing her of stealing clients. Another, desperate and drunk, threatened to cut her face in jealousy. Belle defended herself not with fists but with cunning. She flattered those who mattered, kept her secrets locked tight, and offered loyalty to the madam while others quarrelled. Slowly, grudgingly, her rivals realised she was not easily undone. The nights blurred together, laughter that wasn't real, embraces that meant nothing. Coins clinking into a jar that promised survival, but not yet security. Yet Belle watched and waited. She knew this was not the end of her story, only the apprenticeship. The madam ruled the house with sharp eyes and iron hands, and Belle studied her every move. How she negotiated prices, how she dealt with troublemakers, how she balanced cruelty and kindness to keep her girls in line. Belle absorbed it like scripture, preparing for the day she would no longer serve but command. And in the silence of her room, when the paint was washed from her face and the music below had faded, Belle allowed herself to imagine. Not love, not family, not redemption. Those were illusions she no longer believed in. But power, a house of her own, curtains of velvet not to conceal shame but to announce luxury, men waiting at her door not to use her, but to pay tribute to the empire she would build. In those nights of exhaustion and grief, ambition kept her alive. The city outside raged with its contradictions. Newspapers thundered about the cleansing of vice, yet their editors were seen slipping from parlours after midnight. Preachers roared against women of sin, yet their donations grew suspiciously larger after certain sermons. Policemen raided one house while quietly protecting another that paid more. Belle saw the hypocrisy clearly. The city would never destroy vice, because it needed vice too much. Reformers could shout, but the machine of indulgence kept turning. She realised then that if she could master that machine, she could make herself untouchable. One night, a wealthy horse breeder, a man whose face appeared regularly in society pages, came to the brothel. He was drunk, arrogant, and cruel, mocking the girls, throwing coins at them as though they were dogs. Belle endured his insults in silence, pouring his drink, listening with patience while others grew angry. When he left, staggering into the night, Belle followed his steps to the door, watching. She whispered under her breath a promise to herself. Men like you will bow to me. Her baptism into vice was not marked by one night, but by many. Each encounter stripped another layer of innocence, another illusions of safety. Yet each also gave her another piece of knowledge, another tool for survival. By the time she was 20, Belle was no longer simply a girl trying to survive in a brothel. She was a strategist in training, preparing for the moment when she would seize control. The narrator's voice returns, heavy and deliberate. She had entered the fire not as a choice, but as a necessity. The city forced her into its shadows, but she made those shadows her home. Where others burned to ash, Belle Brezing hardened into iron. The image lingers on Belle, standing at a window. The city stretched before her in gaslight and fog. Behind her, the laughter of men. Before her, the endless hypocrisy of Lexington. She is caught between two worlds, yet belonging fully to neither. And in her eyes glimmers something dangerous, the certainty that she will one day rule them both, fade to black. Lexington's nights had always burned with hidden fire, but by the mid-1880s, the flames seemed hotter, hungrier, as if the city itself had surrendered to its darker appetites. Gambling houses overflowed, saloons lined Main Street like teeth in a predator's jaw, and the brothels spread like ivy along the margins of respectability. Men with polished boots and fine hats crossed the thresholds of those houses nightly, their names whispered with equal parts awe and contempt by the women who entertained them. And among those women, Belle Brezing began to rise. She was no longer the uncertain girl who had first stepped through the doors of a brothel. The years had burned away her hesitations. She had learned which men to humour, which to dismiss, which to flatter, and which to fear. She had learned how to stretch a coin until it glittered like gold, and how to turn cruelty into leverage. Most importantly, she had learned the fragility of survival when one depended upon another's house. The madams who ruled the brothels were both mothers and tyrants to their girls. They provided protection, food, and a bed, but at a price, obedience. To cross them was to risk ruin. Belle had watched as rivals were cast into the streets for breaking rules, watched them sink quickly into poverty, disease, or worse. She understood that as long as she served under another's roof, she would never be safe. The only path forward was to claim a roof of her own. The first venture was small, almost modest, barely more than a rented house dressed up with heavy curtains and second-hand furniture. The wallpaper peeled, the chairs were worn, and the whiskey was not top shelf. Yet when Belle opened her doors, she carried herself as though the house were a palace. She adorned the parlour with velvet drapes, however faded, and kept the lamps lit low to conceal imperfections. She hired only 2 girls at first, women she had known from other houses, and she laid down her law with a clarity that startled them. No drunkenness, no freeloaders, no violence under her roof, and above all, no betrayal of the house. The girls grumbled at first, used to looser rules, but they soon realised Belle's severity had purpose. Clients respected the order of her house, for they could indulge without fear of scandal or chaos. Discretion became her greatest weapon. While other houses erupted in brawls or spilled secrets into the streets, Belle's remained calm, quiet, and sealed tight. What happened behind her velvet curtains stayed there. Word spread quickly. Horse breeders who had once laughed at her in another life now sought her company. Politicians whose careers depended upon spotless reputations found her parlour safer than any other. Lawyers, doctors, judges, all men who needed secrecy, began to slip through her doors. They came not only for pleasure, but for the assurance that Belle Brezing could be trusted. In a city where everyone whispered, she became a vault. Her beauty still mattered then, though time and hardship had sharpened rather than softened her features. But it was not beauty alone that drew men. It was her presence, her unflinching gaze, the way she carried herself as though she had already conquered the city's hypocrisy. Men felt both desired and judged in her company, and in that tension lay her power. Not all welcomed her rise. Other madams saw her as a threat. A younger rival who had learned their tricks and now turned them into weapons. Rumours spread that she bewitched men, that she blackmailed them, that she trafficked in secrets as much as in flesh. Rivals whispered to the police, hoping to bring raids upon her house. Some even sent spies among her girls. Belle responded not with open war, but with cunning. She bribed when necessary, charmed when possible, and enforced loyalty with a quiet ruthlessness that left no doubt who ruled her parlour. Police raids came, as they always did, but Belle had already prepared. She knew which officers could be bought, which needed only a bottle of fine bourbon slipped discreetly into their hands, and which preferred other favours. She turned even danger into negotiation, and though her girls trembled, her house never closed. Lexington's hypocrisy jilted her. Too many powerful men had crossed her threshold to let her fall. By the late 1880s, her house was no longer a modest venture. She had moved into larger quarters, furnished with velvet chairs, mirrors and gilded frames, pianos polished until they gleamed, and carpets thick enough to swallow footsteps. Her girls were trained not only in charm, but in conversation, in music, in the art of appearing refined. Belle demanded sobriety, hygiene, and obedience, enforcing rules that shocked those used to chaos. Yet those who remained thrived, for Belle offered them safety in a world that rarely gave women any at all. Clients marvelled at the transformation. To step into Belle's house was to step into another world, where sin masqueraded as luxury, where shame dressed itself in satin. It was not a brothel in the common sense, it was theatre, and Belle was both playwright and queen. The narrator's voice drifts like smoke through the scene. She had risen from the ashes of disgrace, not merely to survive, but to rule. Where others saw vice, she built empire. Where others fell into ruin, she erected a palace. Belle Brezing was no longer a girl of shadows. She was a madam, young but formidable, her house a mirror to the city itself, velvet on the surface, hypocrisy beneath. And yet her rise was never free of danger. Rivals still plotted, reformers still thundered from pulpits, and the ever-present threat of exposure hung over her like a blade. Each night she ruled her parlour, but each morning she woke knowing the city that used her could turn on her at any moment. It was this awareness that sharpened her further, that taught her never to trust too deeply, never to let her guard fall. In her private moments, Belle sometimes returned to the memory of her mother. The bottle, the rages, the despair. She vowed she would never become Annie, never let drink or weakness claim her. She drank sparingly, worked tirelessly, and clung to the control her mother had lacked. Every curtain she hung, every rule she enforced, every bribe she paid was not merely for profit, but for survival. The camera lingers on her house, lamps glowing through velvet curtains, carriages pulling up discreetly, men slipping inside with collars raised. The sound of piano music drifts through the night, mingled with laughter that echoes like distant bells. Outside, Lexington continues its masquerade, condemning women like Belle while secretly sustaining them. Inside, Belle Brezing reigns, not merely a participant in vice, but its conductor, orchestrating every note. The narrator's voice, low and deliberate, closes the chapter. She had risen, but her throne was built upon fire. Every coin she earned, every curtain she drew, every secret she kept tightened the crown upon her head and sharpened the knives pointed at her back. The young madam had claimed her place, but the price of power is always yet to be paid. Fade to black. Belle's second house, though larger, was still modest compared to the empire she would one day command, but its walls already pulsed with stories. Each evening, the lamps were lit low, curtains drawn, the parlour polished until it shone. A visitor entering might have expected chaos. the drunken laughter and shrill quarrels common to Lexington's vice houses. Instead, they found order. The clink of glasses, the rustle of satin, the low hum of piano keys. Belle had created something new, a sanctuary of vice where shame was cloaked in civility. The first to notice were the gamblers, men who thrived on risk but detested scandal. They came after long nights at the track or in the smoke-filled back rooms of saloons, carrying with them both winnings and losses. Belle greeted them with a smile that was neither coy nor cloying, but measured, steady, as though she knew exactly what they sought. She poured their whiskey in crystal tumblers, never tin cups, never cheap glass, and let them unburden themselves. A man who had lost his fortune spoke more freely than a drunkard, and Belle listened with the patience of a confessor. Then came the politicians, their collars high, their voices low. They slipped through her doors after midnight, when the streets were empty and eyes were fewer. These were men whose reputations could not afford even a whisper, yet they found themselves drawn to Belle's parlour, not only for the women, but for Belle herself. She spoke to them of horses, of markets, of law, never revealing the limits of her knowledge. They left believing she was more than a madam. She was a confidant, a keeper of secrets. And in return, when raids were whispered about, when rival madams spread rumours, those men made certain Belle's name remained untouched. Her rivals noticed. Some attempted sabotage, sending drunken men to start fights in her parlour, bribing her girls to betray her rules, even whispering to newspapers that Belle's house was no better than a den of blackmail. But Belle was patient. She discovered which rivals had loose lips, which girls had been bribed, which policemen had been paid to harass her. And then, with cold precision, she countered. One rival's house was raided weeks after she had accused Belle. Another lost her most lucrative clients when Belle quietly offered a better bargain of discretion. By the time the smoke cleared, Belle's reputation had not only survived, it had strengthened. Inside her own house, she ruled with a mixture of severity and unexpected generosity. She demanded sobriety. Drunkenness was an unforgivable sin, demanded loyalty. Betrayal was met with swift dismissal. Yet she also provided what few madams offered, safety. Her girls were clothed, fed, and protected from violent clients. She paid doctors discreetly when illness came, kept medicine in locked drawers, and even set aside small savings for the women who served her well. Some resented her rules, calling her cold and calculating, but others, hardened by worse houses, grew fiercely loyal, recognizing that under Belle's stern hand they were safer than they had ever been. Stories began to circulate in Lexington about Belle's composure. One tale, perhaps exaggerated, told of a drunken horseman who tried to draw a pistol in her parlour after losing at dice. Rather than scream or flee, Belle had simply walked to him, eyes steady, and laid a hand on his wrist until the pistol dropped. "Not in my house," she was said to have whispered. The man stumbled out, humiliated, and never returned. Another story told of a judge who confided to Belle in drunken despair, revealing secrets that could have ended his career. Belle, it was whispered, never spoke a word of it, and the judge became her most loyal protector. Whether true or not, such stories grew her legend, painting her not as a mere madam, but as a woman both feared and respected. Her rise did not come without loneliness. For all the men who courted her favour, for all the girls who served under her roof, Belle often found herself alone in the small hours of the night. She would sit in her parlour after the lamps were extinguished, the air heavy with perfume and smoke, and listen to the silence. Sometimes she thought of her child, gone so many years before, and felt the old wound open. Sometimes she thought of her mother, dead in her bottle, and felt only steel-hard resolve. She allowed herself no illusions of love or redemption. The world had never offered her those, and she would not waste her time seeking them. But ambition was another matter. Each night she counted her coins, tucked her bribes, polished her rules, and dreamed of something greater. The small house was only a beginning. The velvet curtains, the piano music, the whispers of secrecy, all were rehearsal for a grander stage. Belle's eyes were fixed on something Lexington had never seen before. A brothel so luxurious, so infamous, that it would rival the parlours of New Orleans, perhaps even Chicago. The narrator's voice returns, low and steady, as the camera lingers on Belle seated alone in her parlour, the flicker of lamplight across her face. She was no longer the girl who begged for bread, no longer the child who wept in shadows. She was a woman who had built her own house, her own rules, her own legend. But ambition, once fed, never rests. The young madam dreamed of more, of a palace of vice where kings of Kentucky would bow before her velvet throne, and soon she would claim it. The lamps extinguish one by one, the parlour sinking into darkness. Outside, the sound of hooves on cobblestones. A carriage waits in the fog. The camera lingers on the silhouette of Belle at the window, staring into the night, her expression unreadable, fade to black. Lexington, Kentucky, at the turn of the 20th century, was a city drunk on its own contradictions. It polished its image by day with whitewashed churches, university lectures, and the thunder of hoofbeats at Keeneland, but by night its heartbeat shifted to another rhythm entirely. The streets of the Vice District flickered with gaslight, the air thick with tobacco smoke and bourbon breath, and every alley hummed with whispers of desire. In the centre of it all rose a house unlike any the city had ever seen, Belle Brezing's mansion on McGowan Street. The first glimpse of it at night was enough to stop carriages in their tracks. While other houses along the block sagged with neglect, Belle's stood tall, its windows glowing like a theatre stage. Velvet curtains cascaded in thick folds, shielding the interior from the world outside, but not so tightly that they failed to entice. Lamps hung in polished sconces, casting a warm golden light that made the rain-slick cobblestones shimmer. A carriage would draw up to the curb, wheels crunching against gravel, and a gentleman would descend quickly, hat pulled low, eyes darting left and right before he vanished inside. Crossing Belle's threshold was like stepping into another realm. The air struck first, the mingling scents of lilac perfume, cigar smoke, and the faint sweetness of brandy. Music followed, also and so. Not the raucous fiddle tunes of Lexington's saloons, but a piano, polished and precise, played by one of the girls Belle had trained to strike the keys with elegance. The parlour spread out like a stage set, its carpets thick, its walls adorned with mirrors in gilt frames, their glass catching the flicker of candlelight. Every detail whispered of luxury: velvet sofas, decanters of aged whiskey, crystal glasses that glimmered in the lamplight. It was not simply a brothel, it was a palace of shadows, and Belle reigned as queen. She descended each evening dressed in silks and satins, her hair pinned with jewels, her eyes painted dark as if lined with secrets. She did not rush to greet men or fawn over them. She made them wait, savouring the anticipation, until her presence filled the room like a storm cloud edged with firelight. "Gentlemen," she would say, her voice low and measured, "welcome to my house." It was a statement, not a courtesy. The house was hers, and every man who entered understood he was a guest under her dominion. The girls who worked for Belle were not left to chaos. She trained them, not only in charm, but in etiquette. They knew how to walk gracefully, how to speak with wit, how to play cards without losing their poise, how to pour a drink with a steady hand. Belle insisted they looked like actresses, not beggars, courtesans, not common prostitutes. They wore gowns of satin, their hair styled, their smiles honed like weapons, and behind every smile was Belle's discipline. Drunkenness was forbidden, quarrels punished, disobedience swiftly corrected. Some hated her rules, calling her cold, but others understood the truth. Under Belle's roof they were safer than anywhere else in Lexington. Her clients understood the rules too. Violence was not tolerated. Secrets were sacred. What was whispered within her walls stayed within her walls. It was this discretion that drew men of the highest rank. Horse breeders came after selling stallions for fortunes. Politicians came during campaigns, desperate for comfort they could never admit to their wives. Judges, lawyers, and bankers slipped through her doors, men who condemned vice in public yet sustained it in private. They came not only for flesh, but for the sanctuary Belle provided, a place where their hypocrisy could breathe without consequence. The narrator's voice drifts through the scene like smoke. Her mansion was not merely a house of pleasure. It was a mirror held up to Lexington itself, velvet on the surface, corruption beneath. Within those walls, the city confessed its hunger, and Belle, more than any preacher or politician, heard its truest prayers. Nights in the mansion unfurled like theatre. Dice clattered against polished tables, glasses clinked, laughter rose and fell like music. In one room, a senator whispered into a courtesan's ear, promising her a necklace he would never buy. In another, a gambler threw his last coin on the table and won it back, kissing Belle's hand in delirious gratitude. Upstairs, the sound of doors closing, whispers rising, secrets sealed in satin sheets. Belle moved among it all, with the grace of a conductor, watching, calculating, controlling. But beneath the glamour, danger pulsed. Rivals still circled her empire, envious of her success. Some tried to lure away her girls with promises of higher pay. Others whispered to reformers, urging them to target Belle's house in their shoulder crusades. The police, as always, hovered like vultures, demanding bribes to look the other way. Belle handled it all with iron steadiness. She paid when necessary, flattered when useful, and threatened when unavoidable. She knew her survival depended not only on wealth, but on her ability to bend the city's hypocrisy to her will. The mansion itself became a legend. Locals spoke of it in hushed tones, some with fascination, others with disgust. Young men dared each other to walk past its glowing windows. Women crossed the street rather than meet Belle's gaze if she happened to step outside in daylight. But even those who condemned her could not ignore her presence. She was no longer a shadow, she was a landmark. In time, stories would claim that Margaret Mitchell modelled the character of Belle Watling in Gone with the Wind after Belle Brezing, though truth and legend blurred. What mattered in Lexington then was not fiction, but reality. Belle was the Queen of McGowan Street, and her mansion was her throne room. Yet even at the height of her power, Belle felt the edge of isolation. She dined with men but belonged to none. She commanded loyalty but trusted few. She was both indispensable and disposable, revered and reviled. She ruled Lexington's shadows, but she knew shadows were fickle. A single scandal, a single betrayal could bring her empire crashing down, and still she pressed forward, refusing to surrender to fear. The camera lingers on the mansion. At midnight, its windows glowing, its curtains swaying. A carriage pulls up, a man descends, his face hidden in the brim of his hat. He knocks once, twice, the door opens, and he vanishes inside. The light spills briefly into the street, then closes again, leaving only the sound of laughter and piano drifting into the night. The narrator lowers his voice to a near whisper. Here, on McGowan Street, Belle Brezing reached the height of her reign. Her house was both sanctuary and snare, palace and prison. Lexington's kings bowed before her velvet throne, but even palaces are built on fragile foundations, and every throne casts a shadow, fade to black. The mansion on McGowan Street glowed at a night like a lantern in the fog, but its light did not belong to Belle alone. Behind the velvet curtains, behind the polished mirrors and decanters of whiskey, lived the women whose laughter filled the parlour, whose perfume clung to the air, whose presence made the house what it was. They were the girls of Belle's house, her actresses, her pawns, her soldiers, her daughters and prispawns all at once. They came from everywhere, men drifted in from neighbouring towns, runaways fleeing father's fists or husband's cruelty. Others had been daughters of farmers, lured to Lexington by promises of work in factories or boarding houses, only to discover that survival cost more than wages could cover. A few had been raised within Lexington itself, girls who once braided ribbons in schoolrooms before disgrace, poverty or coercion drove them into the shadows. Each girl carried her story like a scar, though in Belle's house scars were painted over with rouge and powder. A widow who had lost her husband to cholera arrived with nothing but grief. Belle dressed her in satin and called her darling until she learned to smile again. A girl of barely 16, orphaned and desperate, was taught to sit at the piano and play until her fingers no longer trembled. A mother, separated from her child, wept in the Belle's parlour, until Belle reminded her with quiet severity that tears had no place in front of clients. The mansion swallowed their tragedies and reshaped them into performance. Belle's rules bound them. They could drink, but never to drunkenness. They could flirt, but never quarrel. They could earn, but they must pay their share. Their health was monitored, a doctor visited discreetly, his silence secured by Belle's coin. If a girl fell ill beyond repair, she was quietly dismissed, replaced before her absence stirred suspicion. Belle was ruthless, but she was not cruel for cruelty's sake. Her rules were protection, not merely for herself, but for them. In a world where women of their station were often beaten, robbed, discarded, Belle's house was an island of order. And yet, order could be its own prison. The girls whispered about Belle in the quiet hours. Some called her their saviour, the only woman who gave them safety. Others muttered she was a tyrant, profiting from their bodies while living in greater luxury than they ever would. Loyalty and resentment coexisted in equal measure. A girl dismissed for breaking curfew might spit Belle's name like venom, while another would swear Belle had saved her life. Both were true, The mansion itself amplified their contradictions. In the parlour they sparkled like courtesans of Paris, laughing at men's jokes, brushing against them with calculated grace. Upstairs, in the narrow rooms Belle kept hidden from clients, they collapsed into exhaustion, faces stripped of paint, shoulders heavy with weariness. Laughter downstairs, silence upstairs, perfume downstairs, sweat upstairs. A double life within a double life. The men who visited never asked their stories. To them, the girls were fantasy, escape, indulgence. But Belle knew each one. She knew who had fled a farm, who had abandoned a child, who had been beaten, who had been betrayed. She kept their stories close, never speaking of them, but shaping her rules with those memories in mind. In her way, she was both their protector and their warden. Some girls stayed for years, their loyalty unshaken. They dressed finer under Belle than they had ever dreamed, dined better than they had as children, and carried themselves with a confidence they owed to her. Others left quickly, unable to stomach the discipline or the weight of the life itself. Those who left often fared worse, falling into rougher houses where violence reigned. Sometimes a girl would return humbled and broken, and Belle, if she believed in their contrition, might take them back. The narrator's voice drifted through the smoke of the parlour. They were not saints, nor were they demons. They were women carved by circumstance, moulded by hunger, sharpened by survival. Some came to Belle willingly, others with desperation. But once inside her house, they became part of her legend, both elevated and imprisoned beneath her velvet roof. Belle's girls were not without dreams, though most had learned to keep them hidden. Some saved their earnings, hoping one day to buy a boarding house or open a dress shop. Others whispered of escape, of finding love, of starting again in another city where no one knew their names. Belle encouraged practicality, discouraging illusions. She told them plainly that the world did not forgive women like them. "You'll never be wives," she said once, her voice cold but not unkind. "But you can be something else. You can be safe here." Safety, however, was relative. The dangers outside Belle's house were real. Girls who strayed too far into Lexington's red light district risked beatings, robbery, even death. Disease lingered always, threatening to undo Belle's careful order. And jealousy, that most insidious poison, thrived within the house itself. Girls competed for the wealthiest clients, whispered rumours, sometimes even stole from one another. Belle mediated these disputes with an iron hand. She kept them in line not with affection but with authority. They might hate her for it, but they obeyed. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when camaraderie shone through. On quiet nights, when the parlour was empty and the lamps dimmed, the girls gathered in the upstairs hall, trading stories, sharing secrets, laughing at the absurdity of men who strutted like kings by day and whimpered like children by night. In those moments, they were not courtesans but simply women, bound by a strange sisterhood, forged in the fire of survival. Belle sometimes joined them, though never fully. She laughed with them, but her laughter was measured, her distance always maintained. She was their queen, not their sister. And still the contradictions persisted. Some girls adored her, calling her fair, wise, even motherly. Others cursed her name behind closed doors, accusing her of exploiting them for her own fortune. But even those who despised her could not deny that Belle's house was safer than any other in Lexington. She demanded much, but she gave much. The city outside scorned them, but within her mansion they had food, clothing, and at least the illusion of dignity. The narrator's voice lowers, solemn, almost mournful. Their stories have been lost to time. History remembers Belle, but not the women who gave her empire its breath. They lived, they laughed, they suffered, they died, and their names vanished. Only their shadows remain, lingering in the rooms where velvet curtains once swayed. The camera lingers on the parlour. Music drifts upward, glasses clink, laughter rises, but the camera pulls away, through the velvet curtains into the street. Outside, the city continues its masquerade, condemning Belle and her girls while depending on them in secret. The mansion glows against the dark like a beacon, but within its walls live women caught between survival and damnation, safety and captivity, loyalty and resentment. The chapter closes with the image of Belle ascending the stairs, pausing to look at the doors behind which her girls sleep. Her face is unreadable, stern, weary, perhaps touched with something like sorrow. Then she turns away, descending back to her parlour, to her throne. The narrator whispers the final line. Her house was not only built on velvet and secrecy, it was built on the backs of women whose stories the world has forgotten, women who were at once her strength and her ghosts, fade to black. The lamps of Belle Brezing's mansion glowed not for the women who lived within its walls, nor even for Belle herself, but for the men who came to her door in the hush of night. They were the true architects of her fortune, the veins of wealth and power that pulsed through her parlour, men who in daylight wore starched collars and clean gloves, who spoke of virtue and law, who voted on measures of morality with firm voices and upright spines. Yet at night they knocked on Belle's velvet-draped door, their footsteps muffled by shame, their hands trembling with anticipation. They came in carriages, in pairs or alone, their hats pulled low, their collars turned high against the gaze of neighbours. The horses' hooves clattered against the cobblestones, then fell silent as the men descended, glancing left and right before disappearing into the warmth of Belle's house. Inside their masks slipped, and the double lives they lived revealed themselves with a shuddering honesty. There were the horse breeders, men whose names were spoken in the grandstands of Keeneland, whose fortunes rose and fell on the backs of thoroughbreds. By day they strutted across paddocks, their boots gleaming, their cigars fat with pride. They spoke of breeding and bloodlines as if discussing the sacred language of gods. But by night, those same men grew reckless, gambling away winnings, pouring at Belle's girls with hands that had stroked prize horses only hours before. They toasted to victories and wept over losses, their egos swelling and collapsing like waves against a jagged shore. To the public they were kings of Lexington. To Belle, they were children in need of comforting, feeding, or flattering until their coins spilled from their pockets into her coffers. Then there were the politicians, their hypocrisy sharper than any blade. In daylight they thundered against vice, their speeches laced with righteousness. They railed against immorality in our fair city, promising reform, vowing to protect wives and daughters from corruption. Newspapers printed their words in bold letters, praising their honour, but those same men appeared at Belle's door after midnight, their voices lowered, their hats pulled low. They paid for what they condemned, kissed the lips of the women they denounced, and whispered secrets into Belle's ear they would never dare admit in daylight. They lived in a world of masks, and Belle was the only one who saw their faces. Judges, too, slipped into her parlour, men who had sentenced thieves and scoundrels in court that very day. Their robes gave them dignity in the daylight, but at night they shed them like skins. They sought pleasure, indulgence, sometimes cruelty. One judge was known for lecturing women in court about chastity, yet he spent his evenings draped across Belle's velvet sofa, begging for the company of the youngest courtesans. Another judge, grey-haired and stern in daylight, wept into his whiskey at Belle's, confessing sins to a woman who was paid not to judge him. In daylight they held the power of life and death in their gavels. At night they were as powerless as children. Doctors, bankers, lawyers, all found their way to McGowan Street. They claimed to be men of principle, and perhaps in daylight they believed it. But Belle knew their truths. She saw them stripped of dignity, stripped of lies, stripped of their own illusions. She watched as they traded honour for indulgence, as they betrayed the very values they all claimed to uphold, and she profited from it all. The hypocrisy was not hidden from Belle. It was the foundation of her empire. She knew that Lexington demanded purity from its wives and daughters, but also demanded indulgence for its men. She knew that the same mouths that condemned her fed her fortune, and she knew that this contradiction gave her a kind of power few women of her time would ever hold. The narrator's voice cuts through the smoke of the parlour, low and deliberate. Respectability was the mask. Belle's house was the unmasking. The men who ruled Lexington by day surrendered to her by night. They condemned her with their lips, but sustained her with their coin. And in this contradiction lay the essence of Southern honour, a purity demanded of women and an indulgence purchased for men. Belle herself treated her clients with a kind of calculated respect. She never mocked them, never exposed them, never betrayed the secrets they spilled. This discretion became her greatest weapon. Men who might have dismissed her as a common madam soon learned she was far more dangerous. She was a vault of secrets, and they depended on her silence. In a city built on reputation, that silence was worth more than gold. There were stories whispered about Belle's clients, stories that never made it into newspapers but lived in Lexington's memory like shadows. A politician whose career might have ended in scandal, saved only because Belle destroyed a letter he had written in drunken weakness. A banker who trusted Belle with confessions of embezzlement, then funneled her money discreetly to protect himself. A preacher, bold in his condemnation of vice, who nonetheless sought her house weekly, his visits known to Belle, but hidden from his flock. These stories were never proven, but they did not need to be. The power of rumour was enough. Belle knew her position was precarious. She could never confront these men directly, never wield their secrets as open weapons. To do so would destroy her, for their public power far outweighed hers. Instead, she wielded silence itself as her currency. She never revealed, never threatened, never even hinted, but the men knew. And knowing that Belle knew, bound them to her more tightly than any chain. The mansion thrived but because of this unspoken contract. Men could indulge without fear of exposure. Belle's discretion was absolute, and in return her house remained untouchable. Reformers railed, policemen raided, newspapers thundered, but Belle endured. Too many men depended on her, too many reputations rested on the velvet cushions of her parlour. And yet, the hypocrisy grew heavier with every passing year. Lexington's daylight world grew more rigid in its moral posturing, more eager to proclaim purity, while its nighttime indulgence deepened. Belle's mansion became both symbol and scapegoat, the place reformers pointed to as the root of corruption, and the place powerful men visited to sustain their hidden lives. The camera lingers on the mansion at night, its windows glowing, the shadows of men passing through its doors. Their names are not spoken, for history has projected them, but their silhouettes are unmistakable. The broad shoulders of a politician, the stiff posture of a judge, the swagger of a horse breeder. All step into Belle's house. All remove their masks within. The narrator whispers the chapter's closing line. They called her a sinner, a corrupter, a stain upon Lexington's honour. But she was only the mirror. It was not Belle who built the mask of respectability. It was the men who wore it, and she, more than anyone, who knew what lay beneath. Fade to black. The lamps on McGowan Street never burned without risk. Belle knew it each time she ordered them lit, each time she drew her velvet curtains against the night. For while her mansion thrived on secrecy, the city around her grew restless with the sound of reform. Lexington was beginning to stir against its own hypocrisy, and in the pulsing heart of its vice district, Belle Brezing's his house stood as the brightest target. The reformers came first. They gathered in parlours and churches, respectable women with sharp eyes and firm voices. They spoke of cleansing the city, of protecting young women from corruption, of erasing the stain of brothels from Lexington's map. Pamphlets spread through the streets, words scrawled in bold black ink. The soul of our city must be saved. Preachers thundered from pulpits, their voices cracking with righteous fury, condemning houses of shame and naming Belle in all but breath. But while the sermons rang in daylight, Belle's parlour still filled by night. Judges, politicians, breeders, gamblers, all continued to slip through her doors, even as their wives folded pamphlets denouncing her. They lived in two worlds and needed Belle to bridge them. She knew it and she exploited it. Her rivals, however, saw opportunity in the rising tide. Other madams whispered to reformers, hinting that Belle's house was the worst of all, the source of Lexington's corruption. They paid policemen to harass her, spread rumours that Belle trafficked in blackmail, even planted spies among her girls. One rival is said to have bribed a newspaperman to write an exposé that painted Belle's house as a den of depravity beyond all measure. The newspaper article arrived like a blade. Its headline screamed scandal. The Queen of Vice, Lexington's shame on McGowan Street. Inside, the writer described Belle's mansion in lurid detail. The velvet drapes, the laughter of courtesans, the whispers of judges and politicians slipping through her doors. He wrote of her rules, her fortune, her icy composure, painting her not as a woman but as a demon in silk. He never named her clients, of course. Their reputations remained sacrosanct. Belle alone bore the weight of shame. The city buzzed with outrage. Some called for her immediate arrest. Others muttered in admiration of her audacity, but the scandal placed Belle on a precipice. One wrong step and she would tumble into ruin. The raids began soon after. Policemen descended on McGowan Street, boots pounding against the cobblestones, lanterns swinging in the fog. They stormed Belle's mansion, shoving open her doors, shouting orders as if charging into battle. Belle's girls shrieked, their laughter silenced into fear. Men scrambled to hide, pulling on coats, clutching hats, their faces white with terror at the thought of exposure. But Belle remained calm. She greeted the officers with icy poise, as though they were guests rather than intruders. She handed over her books with a smile, already knowing the numbers inside had been carefully arranged. She slipped folded bills into palms when eyes turned away, her silence promising more if the men remembered their loyalties. By dawn, the policemen had gone, their pockets heavier, their threats dissolved. Belle's house reopened the next night, its lamps burning as bright as ever. The narrator's voice cuts through, steady and grave. She survived not by force but by cunning. She bribed when she must, charmed when she could, and stood unflinching when others quailed. Where other madams fell, Belle endured. The city could storm her doors, but it could not break her will. Yet the pressure did not relent. Reformers pressed harder, emboldened by the newspaper scandal. They marched to City Hall, demanding laws against brothels. Preachers thundered with renewed fury, spitting Belle's name like poison. Even some of her most loyal clients began to hesitate, fearful of exposure. Belle faced nights when her parlour stood quieter than before, the weight of emptiness pressing against her velvet walls. It was in those moments she revealed her truest resilience. Rather than collapse, she adapted. She tightened her rules, cutting away the reckless girls who drew attention. She cultivated her most powerful clients, men whose influence could shield her when reformers sharpened their knives. She offered discretion beyond measure, silencing even whispers that might have escaped her walls. Slowly the parlour filled again. Slowly the tide that threatened to drown her receded. Her rivals fared worse. The reformers, eager for victories, turned their attention to other houses. Raids toppled weaker madams, their girls scattered to the streets. One house was burned in a suspicious fire. Another was closed after its keeper was jailed for failing to bribe the right man. One by one, Belle's competitors fell, and when the smoke cleared, her mansion stood taller than before. But survival came at a cost. Belle grew harder, colder. She trusted fewer, guarded her words more carefully, and carried herself with an armour of steel. The laughter of her parlour still rang, the velvet still shimmered, but within Belle herself the warmth of hope had been extinguished. She lived not for joy but for control, and control, once tasted, became her only salvation. The camera lingers on Belle at her parlour table after a raid, the lamps low, the girls asleep upstairs. She sits alone with a glass of whiskey untouched before her, her eyes fixed on nothing. Around her the mansion still gleams, but her face is carved with fatigue, her mouth set in grim determination. She whispers, perhaps to herself, perhaps to the city itself, "You will not break me." The narrator whispers the final line of the chapter. Scandal had tried to destroy her. Reformers had tried to cleanse her, rivals had tried to bury her, yet Belle Brezing endured. And in her endurance her legend only deepened, for Lexington could not live without the very woman it condemned. Fade to black. Outside the velvet glow of Belle Brezing's mansion, Lexington's red light district was a place of peril. The lamps along McGowan Street did not cast enough light to banish the shadows. They only sharpened them. Beyond Belle's curtains lay a world where laughter often ended in screams, where women without protection lived on a knife's edge, and where the city's appetite for sin revealed its most savage teeth. Belle had built her empire on order, but she knew that her house was an exception, not the rule. Most women in Lexington's vice district were not shielded by the velvet and discipline. They lived in crumbling boarding houses, their rooms stinking of mildew and despair. They dressed not in satin but in cast-off gowns, their paint smeared rather than polished. They entertained men who paid in coins too small and demanded too much, and they bore the cost of Lexington's hypocrisy with their own bodies. The violence was constant. A drunkard, his pride wounded by a courtesan's laughter, might strike her until she bled. A gambler, furious at a loss, might drag a girl into the street, fists pounding until she lay motionless. Policemen sometimes intervened, but more often they turned away, unless a bribe was offered, unless the girl was of use to someone with influence. In the alleys behind saloons, women's bodies were found crumpled like discarded dolls, their lives extinguished without consequence. Disease stalked the district like a ghost. Syphilis, gonorrhea, tuberculosis, words whispered with dread, words that carried death in their syllables. Girls too poor to pay for a doctor endured their fevers in silence, their beauty rotting, their futures erased. Belle paid for physicians to visit her mansion discreetly, ensuring her girls stayed healthy enough to serve. But beyond her walls, illness spread unchecked, a plague upon the forgotten. Many did not live to see 30. The suicides were whispered about, though never printed in the papers. A young woman, no more than 18, leapt into the Kentucky River one winter's night, her body found days later frozen in the current. Another hanged herself in a boarding house after her lover abandoned her. The city clucked its tongue, muttering, of fallen women who had reaped what they sowed. But Belle knew the truth. They had been broken by a world that used them, condemned them, and left them no escape. The narrator's voice cuts through, solemn and unyielding. Outside Belle's mansion, vice was not velvet but blood. It was not laughter but cries. It was not survival but ruin. For every woman who found shelter under Belle's rules, there were 10 more who perished in the shadows. Violence was not confined to the women alone. Men too met their deaths in the red light district, often at the edge of a knife. Gambling debts ended in alleyway stabbings, barroom quarrels spilled into the street, pistols drawn, shots echoing through the night. Belle's mansion stood only blocks away, yet she forbade her girls from stepping outside after dark. She knew the district was no theatre there. It was a battlefield. Stories circulated like curses. A man who refused to pay was said to have been beaten to death by 3 women wielding broken bottles. Another was found gutted in the mud after boasting too loudly of his winnings. A girl vanished from a rival brothel, her body never found, though her blood stained the walls. These tales grew in the telling, half legend, half truth, but they carried a warning Belle heeded always. Order was the only defence against chaos, and so she enforced her rules with even greater severity. Her girls were never to quarrel with clients, never to step outside with them, never to drink beyond control. She locked her house like a fortress each night, guards at the door, lamps burning bright, music filling the air to drown out the screams that sometimes echoed from the district beyond. The mansion became not just a palace of vice, but a sanctuary from the violence that claimed so many lives. Yet even Belle could not keep the darkness entirely outside. On storm-soaked nights, when the rain flooded the streets and thunder rolled across the city, men sometimes burst into her parlour drunk with rage, demanding more than she permitted. Twice, knives were drawn within her walls. Twice Belle herself intervened, her voice steady, her eyes sharp, her hand resting on the pistol she kept hidden beneath her gown. Each time the intruder fled, cowed not by violence, but by the certainty that Belle Brezing was not to be crossed. But she could not shield her girls from the knowledge of what waited outside. They saw the bodies carried past her mansion, saw the headlines buried in the back of newspapers, saw the way policemen spoke of women like them as if they were already corpses. Fear lived in their bones. Belle did what she could, food, clothing, medicine, discipline, but even she could not promise safety forever. The hypocrisy of Lexington grew sharper in these years. Preachers thundered that the violence was God's punishment on fallen women. Politicians condemned the district while pocketing bribes from its keepers. Respectable women crossed the street. Rather than pass a courtesan, yet their husbands filled the girls' purses by night. And through it all, the bodies accumulated, in rivers, in alleys, in unmarked graves. The narrator lowers his voice to a near whisper. It was not the velvet parlour that defined Lexington's vice, but the shadow that stretched beyond it. Belle's mansion was the exception, not the rule. For most women, the district was not survival, but damnation, a slow death disguised as laughter. The camera drifts through the streets at night. A saloon door bursts open, spilling out 2 men locked in combat, fist striking, blood spraying. A woman screams in the alley as a shadow drags her into darkness. A policeman strolls past, eyes averted, his hand heavy with bribe money. The lamps flicker, the fog thickens, and the district pulses with danger, like a wound that will not close. Then the camera cuts to Belle's mansion, its windows glowing, piano music drifting into the night. Inside, men laugh, women smile, glasses clink. The contrast is sharp, jarring, almost unbearable. Here, order. Out there, chaos. Belle knew she could not save them all. She never tried. Her concern was her house, her girls, her survival. Yet in the silence of her room when the lamps were extinguished, she sometimes thought of the others, the women who had not found her door, who had died in alleys, who had slipped into rivers. She did not weep, but she remembered. The chapter closes with the image of Belle staring out her window at the fog-shrouded street, her silhouette framed by the velvet curtains. Outside a scream echoes. Inside, Belle's face is unreadable, carved of shadow and firelight. The narrator delivers the final line like a tolling bell. Her mansion was velvet against blood, order against chaos, sanctuary against ruin. But the shadow of violence pressed always at her door, a reminder that even queens cannot rule forever. Fade to black. Lexington had long styled itself the Athens of the West, a city of horsemen and scholars, of bourbon and tobacco, of grand homes shaded by ancient trees. But beneath its polished surface lay another engine, one no newspaper admitted, no politician confessed, no preacher named aloud from the pulpit. It was the hidden economy of vice, and at its heart Belle Brezing's mansion pumped like a velvet vein. Every coin that slid across her tables, every glass of bourbon poured in her parlour, every whispered secret sealed with satin, all of it fed into the city's prosperity. Lexington's wealth was not merely bred in its stables or distilled in its barrels. It was spent in Belle's house, then woven back into the fabric of the city in ways polite society pretended not to see. The horsemen were her most reliable patrons. They came during sales, auctions and races, their pockets swollen with winnings, their egos swollen still more. They gambled in Belle's parlour as easily as they did at the track, dice tumbling against polished wood, cards flickering like sparks in the lamplight. A fortune might be lost in a single night, yet the loser would return the next evening, pockets filled again, desperate for another chance. Belle took her share with calm precision. The house was never cheated. The odds always leaned toward her. The bourbon men followed, distillers and dealers who flooded the markets with Kentucky's golden pride. They toasted Belle with their own spirits, pouring her rarest bottles, eager for her approval. They brought with them not only drink but influence, for bourbon was more than liquor. It was Lexington's bloodline, traded from saloons to parlours, from parlours to political offices. Belle poured their whiskey into crystal, sold it at prices higher than saloons dared ask, and the men paid gladly, for in her house, bourbon tasted of secrecy and sin. Politicians too found their way to McGowan Street, their visits timed with campaigns and conventions. They sought comfort after long days of speeches, or escaped from the eyes of rivals. Their money came from donors and lobbyists, but Belle saw it filtered through her parlour, disguised as pleasure. And when reformers pressed too hard, when police raids drew too close, it was often these same politicians who whispered to soften the blow. They depended on her, and she depended on them. The narrator's voice, calm but sharp, cuts through the smoke-filled air. Belle's house was not a parasite on Lexington's wealth. It was part of its bloodstream. Horse racing, bourbon, politics, gambling, all flowed through her parlour, all left their tribute on her velvet tables. The city condemned her with one hand, but with the other, it fed her fortune. Belle herself treated her house like a business empire. She kept books careful and meticulous, recording each coin, each expense, each bribe. She managed her girls not as servants but as investments, keeping them healthy, clothed and trained. She invested in her house, refurbishing when necessary, draping it in luxury that made men forget the squalor outside. She bribed policemen like one might pay taxes, ensuring her business license was never revoked. Every decision was calculated, every indulgence measured. Her rivals, less disciplined, crumbled around her. They spent recklessly, trusted the wrong policeman, allowed their houses to descend into chaos. Reformers toppled them one by one, their girls scattered into the streets. But Belle's mansion endured, because it was not only a brothel, it was an institution, a business tied to Lexington's greatest industries. Rumours spread of the sums she commanded. Some whispered that on race weeks she made more than a banker in a month. Others said her house profited as much from whiskey as any saloon in town. Whether true or not, Belle's reputation as Lexington's richest madam grew until even her enemies spoke her name with a grudging respect. She was not merely a sinner. She was a force of economy. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Newspapers printed reformist sermons one day and advertisements for bourbon the next. Preachers veiled against vice on Sunday mornings and found their way to Belle's parlour Sunday night, Politicians campaigned on morality while paying Belle for silence. And through it all, the money flowed, from the racetrack, from the distillery, from the law office, into Belle's velvet purse. The camera lingers on a Kentucky Derby week. The streets of Lexington swell with visitors, carriages crowding the roads, hotels overflowing. The racetrack roars with cheers, coins exchange hands in frantic bets, bourbon bottles empty in the stands. And at night, the crowd shifts to McGowan Street, where Belle's lamps glow brighter than ever. Her parlour fills with laughter. Her girls glide through the room like actresses, and money pours across her tables until the carpets themselves seem soaked in it. The narrator whispers, "In daylight, Lexington crowned its champions on the racetrack." At night, they crowned themselves in Belle's house, and the coins that fell from their hands fed not only her fortune but the city itself, weaving vice into Lexington's very prosperity. But every fortune carries its danger. The more Belle profited, the more she drew attention. Reformers pointed to her as proof of Lexington's corruption. Rivals envied her wealth, whispering to newspapers of her extravagance. Policemen demanded larger bribes, threatening raids if their palms were not filled. Even her own girls sometimes grew restless, resentful that Belle lived in greater luxury than they ever could. The very economy she commanded was also the knife pressed against her throat. And yet, Belle endured. She paid when she must, charmed when she could, and tightened her rules until her mansion ran with the precision of a machine. Each night, as the lamps flickered and the piano played, she sat like a queen at the centre of her empire, watching coins fall, secrets whispered, reputation risked. The city lived in denial, pretending her house was an aberration, while in truth it was the beating heart of its economy. The chapter closes with the image of Belle at her desk, her ledger open, her quill scratching figures into the page. Outside, the sounds of laughter and music rise. She pauses, lifting her head, her eyes sharp in the lamplight. The fortune she has built is vast, but she knows it is fragile. Every coin is a victory. Every coin is also a threat. The narrator delivers the final line like a warning. She had woven herself into Lexington's wealth, made herself indispensable to its horses, its bourbon, its politics, but the higher the throne, the sharper the fall, and already voices in the city were calling for the noose to tighten. Fade to black. By the first years of the 20th century, Lexington was changing. The same cobblestones that once echoed with carriages bound for Belle Brezing's mansion now carried the clatter of reformers' marches. The city that had fattened itself on bourbon, horses, and velvet shadows began to choke on its own hypocrisy. And at the heart of that tension stood Belle, her lamp still burning, her curtains still drawn, her empire glittering, even as the world outside sharpened its knives. The reformers had grown louder. Churches overflowed with sermons against sin, the preachers' voices trembling with indignation. Women's groups organised, their members armed not with pistols but with petitions, letters, and relentless conviction. They called themselves Clean City Committees, Moral Reform Leagues, Societies for the Protection of Women. Their meetings were filled with language as fiery as any revival. The brothels must be shuttered. The saloons must be closed. The gamblers must be driven out. Lexington must be purified. Pamphlets spread like wildfire. Headlines blazed in the newspapers. Vice must be expelled from our city. Campaigns drew signatures by the hundreds. Petitions laid before councilmen who only years earlier had slipped through Belle's door. The public mood was shifting. What had once been tolerated with silence was now being shouted down with fervour. The red light district felt the pressure. Raids increased. Policemen stormed houses more frequently, dragging girls into the street, arresting madams, humiliating clients. The once bustling rows of brothels grew quieter. Curtains that once glowed with lamplight were drawn forever, their houses abandoned, their names erased. The air that had once pulsed with music and laughter grew still, broken only by the echo of boots and the cries of women scattered into the night. But Belle's mansion still stood. Her lamp still burned, her piano still played, her velvet still gleamed. While lesser houses fell like dominoes, Belle's endured. She had always understood the game better than her rivals. She had bribed more wisely, cultivated more powerful allies, and run her house with more precision. Her reputation for discretion shielded her from the full force of reform. Too many men in high office had sat in her parlour to allow her destruction. To burn Belle was to risk their own ruin. And yet the noose was tightening. Reform was not only moral, it was legal. Ordinances were passed restricting gambling, banning liquor, threatening fines and imprisonment for brothel keepers. Women's groups pressured politicians with relentless force, reminding them of their duty to wives and children. National movements gave local reformers strength, linking Lexington to a broader crusade sweeping across America. The age of indulgence was fading. The age of respectability, rigid, merciless, unforgiving, was rising. Belle refused to surrender. She had built her mansion on defiance, and she would not abandon it because the city suddenly pretended to grow a conscience. Each night she lit her lamps as if nothing had changed. Each night her parlour filled with laughter, music, and whispered secrets. She carried herself with the same poise, the same unyielding gaze, as though the reformers marching outside were no more dangerous than the rain. But she felt it. She saw the dwindling numbers. Some clients, once loyal, grew hesitant, fearful of exposure. Others fled Lexington entirely, taking their indulgences to Louisville or Cincinnati. The girls too grew restless, sensing the walls closing in. Some left the mansion, seeking quieter lives, though most found only hardship in the world beyond. Belle filled the gaps with new faces, but the illusion of stability grew harder to maintain. The narrator's voice cuts through, low and steady. Empires rarely fall in one blow. They wither. They rot from the edges inward. Belle's mansion still glittered with velvet and crystal, but the rot was spreading. Outside her walls the world was changing, and Belle, proud, defiant, unyielding, refused to bend. The streets around McGowan Street changed too. Where once music spilled from every doorway, now silence lingered. Windows were boarded, doors chained. The police patrolled more heavily, their lanterns sweeping through alleys like searchlights. Reformers boasted of progress, pointing to the crumbling vice district as proof of their victory. But even as they cheered, Belle's house glowed, a stubborn ember against the darkness. This only sharpened their fury. To them, Belle became more than a madam. She became a symbol, the embodiment of sin itself. Pamphlets spoke of her mansion as a palace of corruption. Her name spat like a curse. Women gathered outside her house to pray, their voices rising in hymns, their eyes lifted heavenward. The spectacle drew crowds, some jeering, some solemn, some amused. Belle, it was said, stood once at her window watching them with a faint smile, her face unreadable. Inside, however, the strain grew. Belle's wealth still flowed, but more cautiously. Bribes demanded more of her purse. Raids were more dangerous, sometimes ending in arrests that cost dearly to untangle. The girls grew anxious, whispering of leaving before it was too late. Even the mansion itself seemed to groan with the weight of time. Its curtains, though still velvet, frayed at the edges. Its carpets dulled, its mirrors spotted. Beneath the glow, decay was creeping. The narrator lowers his voice, mournful, almost elegiac. She had ruled longer than any madam in Lexington's history. She had outlasted rivals, scandals, raids, and whispers. But no woman, no house, no empire of shadows can outlast time itself. The red light district was dying, and though Belle still reigned, her throne trembled beneath her. The camera lingers on the street outside her mansion. The lamps burn, but fewer carriages arrive. The music plays, but softer, wearier. A hymn drifts in from outside, voices raised against her walls. Belle sits in her parlour, her face lit by lamplight, her expression steady, her glass of whiskey untouched. She will not yield, but the shadows around her are growing longer. The narrator whispers the final line of the chapter. The city that once crowned her queen now demanded her ruin. And though she stood defiant, the velvet empire of McGowan Street was already fading into dust. Fade to black. The velvet curtains still hung in Belle Brezing's mansion, but by the 1920s they were heavy with dust. The lamps still burned, but their glow revealed cracks in the plaster and carpets worn thin by decades of footsteps. The piano still played, but the notes seemed slower now, echoing against empty rooms rather than the laughter of crowded parlours. Lexington's Queen of Vice still lived, but her empire had withered. The world outside had changed. Prohibition swept through the nation, striking at the bourbon that had long poured into Belle's crystal glasses. Women had won the vote. their voices now louder in the halls of power that once belonged only to men. Reformers had claimed victory, their crusades celebrated in headlines. The red light district that once pulsed with music and desire had collapsed, its houses shuttered, its streets emptied. The district was a ghost town, and Belle, once its queen, remained in her mansion like a relic no one dared disturb. Her health began to fail, years of worry, of whiskey sipped carefully but steadily, of nights spent holding her empire together, had carved lines deep into her face. Arthritis stiffened her joints, her once imposing stride slowed to a shuffle. Illness shadowed her. Some days she could not rise from bed, her body too weary to command the house that had once thrived on her authority, yet she refused to abandon it. She lived within those walls until the end, as though leaving would mean surrendering the legend she had built. Visitors described the mansion in these years as both haunting and heartbreaking. Once, its rooms glowed with velvet and gold. Now they sagged with decay. Dust coated the drapes. Cobwebs clung to corners. The perfume of decades past lingered faintly, but was overpowered by the stale scent of neglect. The grand mirrors, once polished to reflect laughter and light, stood spotted and cracked, reflecting only fragments of the woman who had ruled there. Belle herself became a ghost in her own house. She rarely appeared into public, and when she did, she was veiled, her face hidden from the curious eyes of a city that still whispered her name. The women were gone, the clients gone, the piano mostly silent. Only Belle remained, walking slowly through the halls where once she had ruled like a queen. Lexington's citizens spoke of her with mixed voices. Some pitied her, calling her an old woman who had outlived her time. Others still spat her name like a curse, blaming her for the city's sins. Yet beneath their judgment was fascination. She had endured longer than anyone believed possible, outlasting rivals, reformers, even the collapse of the world she had once commanded. To some she was a scandal, to others a survivor, to all she was unforgettable. The narrator's voice drifts like a sigh through the empty halls. The mansion had been a palace, a sanctuary, a theatre of desire. Now it was a tomb. Its queen still lived within, but her crown was tarnished, her throne broken. She had reigned for decades, but time is the only rival no empire can conquer. In her final years, Belle lived in almost complete isolation. A handful of loyal servants remained, tending to her needs, but most had gone. She sat for hours by the window, staring into streets that no longer pulsed with carriages and whispers, but with automobiles and the clamour of a new age. Lexington had moved on, leaving her behind, yet her pride endured. She never begged, never asked the city for forgiveness, never confessed regret. If she carried sorrow, it remained locked behind her lips. When asked of her past, she spoke little, her eyes sharp enough to silence questions. She had lived on her own terms, and she would die on them too. On August 11th, 1940, Belle Brezing's story came to an end. She died in her bed within the decaying walls of her mansion, alone but not forgotten. She was 80 years old, her life spanning from the ashes of the Civil War to the dawn of the Second World War, a life marked not by purity or respectability but by survival, cunning and rule. Her funeral was sparsely attended. A few loyal friends came, a handful of curious onlookers, but the grand carriages of Lexington's elite did not appear. The men who had once filled her parlour, whose reputation she had shielded, whose fortunes had flowed through her hands, did not stand at her grave. They had long since buried her in silence, their debt to her erased in the pretence of respectability. The preacher spoke of sin and mercy. The dirt was thrown upon her coffin, and the city turned the page. But her legend did not die. Whispers remained, stories retold in saloons and parlours, her name invoked with fascination and disdain. The mansion, decaying though it was, stood as a reminder of her reign. Neighbours spoke of seeing her ghost at the windows, her silhouette framed against the fading light, as though even death could not drive her from the velvet walls she had claimed. The narrator's voice, mournful and measured, closes the scene. She had been a child of shadows, a woman of fire, a queen of vice. She outlived her rivals, defied reformers, and built an empire upon hypocrisy. But time erases even queens. Belle Brezing died alone, her funeral scarcely noticed. Yet her shadow still lingered, draped in velvet, whispering through the streets of Lexington. The camera lingers on the crumbling mansion, its windows broken, its curtains tattered. The wind stirs the dust, carrying faint echoes of piano music, of laughter long vanished, a ghost of a house for the ghost of a woman who once ruled it, fade to black. By the time Belle Brezing was lowered into the earth in 1940, Lexington believed it had closed the book on her story. The mansion on McGowan Street sagged in decay, its curtains eaten by moths, its piano silent, its lamps extinguished. Reformers congratulated themselves that the Queen of Vice was gone, her reign ended. But death did not silence her. Death instead began her second life, the life of myth. A year earlier, the silver screen had given the world a woman who bore Belle's shadow, though softened, gilded, and wrapped in sympathy. Gone with the Wind had premiered in 1939, its sweeping tale of the Old South shimmering with romance and tragedy. Among its characters was Belle Watling, the Madam of Atlanta, dressed in gaudy finery, speaking with a rough charm, despised by society yet revealed as generous and loyal. Audiences across America wept for her kindness, laughed at her boldness, and forgave her sins because she was rendered human, even noble. Those who knew Lexington's history whispered immediately, Belle Watling was Belle Brezing. The resemblance was too sharp to ignore. Mitchell, the author of the novel, had never named her source, but the echoes rang clear. A woman of vice, beloved by men, scorned by women, a keeper of secrets, a figure of paradox. It was Belle reborn, this time in Technicolor. But the Belle Watling of Hollywood was not the Belle Brezing of history. She was a softened mirror, polished until the audience could bear to look. The film's Belle was tragic but virtuous in her way, sacrificing her own reputation to aid Rhett Butler, giving money for the hospital with trembling hands, confessing her love for a man she could never truly have. She was the sinner with a saint's heart, the fallen woman redeemed by loyalty. The real Belle had been harder. She was not tragic, not meek, not quietly sacrificial. She was a strategist, a queen who commanded her house with iron rules, who bribed policemen, who destroyed rivals with cunning. She did not beg to be loved. She demanded to be feared and respected. She was not a woman who gave charity with trembling hands, but one who calculated every coin, every alliance, every silence. If she had a heart, it was locked in iron, shaped by hunger, grief, and survival. And yet the myth endured. For Lexington, the invention of Belle Watling was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it cloaked their Queen of Vice in Hollywood romance, erasing the harsher truths of her reign. On the other, it ensured her memory would never vanish. When people spoke of Gone with the Wind, they spoke also of Belle Brezing. When audiences sympathised with Belle Watling, they were unknowingly mourning Belle of Lexington. The narrator's voice cuts in, soft but edged. History had made her infamous. Hollywood made her immortal. But in the translation from flesh to myth, something was lost. The grit, the cruelty, the resilience, the contradictions that no camera could capture. Belle Watling was a character. Belle Brezing had been a woman Lexington could not escape her ghost. Tourists who flocked to the city asked about her. Old-timers told half-true stories of the mansion on McGowan Street, their voices mixing admiration with disdain. Her name slipped into local lore, half curse, half legend. For every preacher who condemned her memory, there was a saloon patron who toasted her cunning. For every reformer who spat her name, there was a gambler who whispered it with respect. The myth grew until the line between truth and fiction blurred entirely. Some swore Belle Watling was a perfect reflection of Belle, proof that even in sin she had a noble soul. Others swore the opposite, insisting the film had romanticised a woman who had been ruthless, calculating and unrepentant. Between these extremes lay the real Belle, her life too complex to fit the frame of a single character. The mansion itself, long decayed, became the focal point of her legend. Children whispered that her ghost walked its halls, still clad in velvet, her jewels glinting in the dark. Neighbours claimed to see her silhouette in the windows at night, staring down at the street as though waiting for the carriages that would never return. Some swore they heard piano music drifting from the abandoned parlour, laughter echoing faintly in rooms long empty. The house became a monument not to sin, but to memory, to the persistence of a woman the city could not forget. The narrator lowers his tone, almost conspiratorial. Legends rarely tell the truth. They tell what people wish to believe, and so Belle Brezing became Belle Watling, the sinner softened, the Madam Forgiven, the Queen transformed into a tragic heroine. But behind the velvet mask of myth still lingered the harder truth, that Belle had not been saved by love, nor redeemed by charity. She had ruled and she had survived, until time itself claimed her. The camera lingers on a reel of Gone with the Wind, the actress as Belle Watling smiling nervously, offering the kindness. Then the frame flickers, dissolves into the image of the real Belle, seated in her mansion, her gaze sharp, her lips unsmiling. The contrast is stark, jarring, unavoidable. Hollywood had given America a Belle who could be pitied, even loved. Lexington had known a Belle who was neither. But both Belles, the myth and the woman, lingered, refusing to be erased. The chapter closes with the image of the mansion crumbling, ivy crawling across its stones, windows broken. Yet in the air there is the faintest whisper of laughter, of music, of perfume. The ghost of Belle Brezing, or perhaps Belle Watling, still walks, caught forever between history and legend. The narrator delivers the last line with a weight that settles like dust. She was not Belle Watling. She was not the softened shadow Hollywood adored. She was Belle Brezing. Harder. Sharper, crueler, kinder, more complex than any story could contain. And yet, in the end, she became both. A woman of flesh and a myth of velvet. Fade to black. The streets of Lexington are quiet now. The lamps burn with electricity instead of gas, their light harsh and clean where once it shimmered soft and golden. The horses that once clattered down the cobblestones have been replaced by the hum of engines. The city has grown, reshaped itself, modernized its skin. But the air still carries whispers. Whispers of a woman who ruled the shadows, who turned hypocrisy into empire, who lingered in velvet long after her time was gone. Belle Brezing's mansion is no more. The walls crumbled, the velvet rotted, the mirrors shattered. Time took back what she had stolen from it. Where once carriages lined the street and men in starched collars slipped through her doors, now there is nothing but empty space, the ghosts of laughter and piano music dissolved into silence. Yet for those who know where to look, the outline remains. The street remembers, the soil remembers, Lexington remembers. The city does not speak her name aloud, not in its official histories, not in the polished brochures it gives to visitors. Lexington sells its bourbon, its horses, its heritage of honour. It does not sell its ghosts. And yet, in the quiet corners, in the whispers between locals, Belle still walks. They call her a sinner. They call her a corrupter. They call her a queen of shame. But they also call her survivor, tactician, woman who bent Lexington's most powerful men to her will. She was both despised and indispensable, condemned and sustained. She embodied the contradiction of a city that demanded purity in daylight and indulgence in darkness. The narrator's voice drifts like smoke. She was never just a woman. She was a mirror in which Lexington saw itself, though it pretended not to look. A city that prayed with one hand and sinned with the other, that crowned its daughters with virtue while buying its knights from women like Belle. She did not corrupt Lexington. Lexington corrupted itself, and Belle had the audacity to profit from the truth. Even now, her ghost lingers. Walk McGowan Street at dusk, and some swear they hear the faint clink of glasses, the rustle of skirts, the low hum of piano keys. Neighbours have spoken of a figure in the window, tall, severe, draped in shadow. Others whisper of laughter carried on the wind, brittle and perfumed. Children dare each other to call her name aloud, though their voices falter when the wind shifts suddenly, when the air grows colder. The myth has grown larger than the woman ever was. To some she is a southern Jezebel, cursed and damned, her soul forever restless. To others she is a tragic heroine, punished not for sin but for survival, forced into a life she did not choose, enduring longer than anyone believed possible. And to still others, she is simply a ghost of Kentucky, a velvet echo of a past the city cannot fully bury. Gone with the Wind softened her into Belle Watling, a woman audiences could pity, a sinner redeemed by loyalty. But Lexington remembers differently. Those who carry the true stories, who read the old newspapers, who listen to the last descendants of her girls, know that Belle was far more complicated. She was not redeemed, she was not condemned, she was both. The curtain falls on her life, but the question lingers like the last note of a piano in an empty hall. Who was Belle Brezing? A monster? A victim, a strategist, a queen? The answer shifts depending on who speaks. In truth, she was all of these and none. The camera drifts slowly through Lexington's modern streets, past the racetrack where horses still run, their hooves striking the earth like drums of history, past the bourbon distilleries, where barrels still breathe in their oak casks, past the churches where sermons still thunder against sin, and past the empty lot where Belle's mansion once stood, now swallowed by time, yet still heavy with presence. The narrator whispers the final lines like a benediction and a curse. She lived in shadows, ruled in velvet, and died alone. But her story did not end with her death. It lingers still, in whispers, in myths, in the uneasy conscience of a city that both condemned and needed her. Was she a sinner who damned Lexington? Or was she its truest mirror? The answer lies not in history nor in legend, but in the space between them, where memory becomes myth, and the velvet ghost of Kentucky still walks. The screen fades to black. For a moment, silence, then faintly the sound of a piano, a single melancholy note that echoes until it vanishes. Curtain fall.